Well, Fort Pulaski, which is situated on Cockspur Island at the mouth of the Savannah River, was used to protect Savannah. Actually, Fort Pulaski was the third fort to actually be out here. The first was Fort George in the 1760s, then Fort Greene in the 1790s once we had our United States. And then after the War of 1812, there was a great push to better defend our coastline, and Fort Pulaski is part of a family of forts that's constructed really from the 1820s all the way through the American Civil War. Now, for its real significance, the fort is a wonderful microcosm of the entire conflict, from secession to having a battle here to even emancipation. We really encompass it all out here at Fort Pulaski. Well, we interact with visitors now in so many different ways, from visitors from all across the globe that come here. I mean, we see close to 400,000 visitors a year coming to Fort Pulaski itself, and we have a very active guided interpretation program, doing tours, we do weapons demonstrations, but even now, of course, with social media, we're able to reach even more people. So with all these folks, I mean, close to 400,000 visitors, I mean, we have a lot that are coming from the local area, whether it's folks from Savannah, Atlanta, even Charleston. But because of its location near Savannah, we see so many people from California. We'll see international travelers as well. Because we're named for Casimir Pulaski, we get a lot of Polish visitors as well that will come here to see Fort Pulaski, to learn about the fort and the fact that he didn't have anything to do with the fort itself, but his role in the Battle of Savannah in 1779, and the fact that he was killed here in Savannah, I mean, means a lot. Well, 2016 and 2017, during our fiscal year 2017, we were impacted 3 different times. We had Hurricane Matthew in October of 2016. We had a tornado rip through the park in May, and then we've just dealt with Hurricane Irma coming through here as well. So I think we're still trying to kind of get our wits about ourselves as to what has taken place over the past year. Because prior to this, there are a number of instances, but very few. In fact, folks have always talked about the Georgia Bight and how we have generally been protected. Now, as interpreters and as historians here, we know that in the 1880s and 1890s, this area was heavily impacted by hurricane activity that, in fact, put a tremendous amount of water inside the fort itself. So the fort is not new to extreme weather events. However, as we have more, well, the situations around us, whether it's sea level rise, whether it's the degradation of the marshland around Cockspur Island and along the Georgia coastline, as well as higher storm surges, we're seeing a lot more impacts, and we will see a lot more impact as we move forward. I mean, Tybee Island, which is our closest community, which is really just a mile away, during Hurricane Matthew, they had a little bit of flooding, but not, I won't say that Tybee Island was inundated by water. However, there was a tremendous amount of damage done to the dune systems out there. So almost a year later with Hurricane Irma, there was a lot more flooding out there. Now, one thing that we can talk about here for Fort Pulaski, we just have to go back nearly 40 years. In 1979, we had Hurricane David. We had a storm surge, at our tide gauge measuring a little over 12 feet, which has now been surpassed by both Matthew and Irma. But with the data back then, there was very little flooding here at Fort Pulaski. But in nearly 40 years, for a number of different reasons, we have a tremendous amount of flooding with just a couple of inches of surge. So there's certainly a lot that's going on in the environment around us. Absolutely. Fort Pulaski relies on the fee revenue that we're able to generate at our entrance station. And while we're still going to see the effects over the next couple of years, from this past year, we were closed for a total of 3 months with these 3 incidents. So that's going to affect how we operate, whether it's our hours, who we're able to hire, and what kind of programs we're able to provide our visiting public. Absolutely. The park is very aware of the environment around us, whether it's storms happening in the Atlantic Basin right now to what could happen over the next several years. And especially considering that the sea level is rising, we have to look at Fort Pulaski and how it's protected. It has a dike system that was actually designed when the fort was constructed to help protect the fort. Now we have to potentially look at how we deal with that dike system, whether it's raising the level of the dike system or whether we retreat in other areas to allow marshland to potentially reestablish itself. There are many different factors that we'll be looking at. Unfortunately, I know there are discussions about that, but that's a level I've not been privy to all those discussions. Now I know, again, kind of in our situation, that there are talks with how we can potentially move forward, especially after the storm activity that we've had, because clearly this is not going to be an isolated incident, that there are probably more storm events over the horizon. And how can we be better prepared, how we can be able to save and work to preserve our cultural resources and our natural resources that we have here, but how we can do that fiscally responsible. That's what we're going to be looking at. Oh, it's changing, that's for sure. I mean, there's no way that you can deny that we have more high water events, whether it's on the U.S. Highway 80 causeway heading out to Tybee Island, and even the storms that affect us. Whether it's the marsh degradation, again, potentially the settling of our dike system, and a number of different factors. I mean, it's something that it's eye-opening. When you come out here, especially on any of the spring or king tides that we have, where you see how close the water is on a perfectly sunny, beautiful day. And then you add in the specter of a huge storm coming through here with a large storm surge and the kind of damage that it can be. I mean, the weather is awesome, and it's something that you have to be careful of, you have to be watchful and mindful of. I mean, it's so impressive to see what can happen. I mean, the amount of water that was surrounding Fort Pulaski was just, to me, mind-boggling. Outside of the fort, if you were standing in our parking lot, you would have been underwater. And that's just, I was there the next day and the water had drained. We have culverts that drain that water. But still, coming up to the fort in knee-deep water, thinking about what had just happened less than 24 hours before, it's just it's a scary prospect. So as we progress with recovery, as we fix infrastructure, as we bring areas in the park back online, the visitors are very aware. Even as we move months after an event, there is still tangible evidence from these storms, whether it's downed trees, whether there are still remnants from storm debris. But in our programming, I mean, it's very important that we're talking about not only the cultural history of Fort Pulaski, but our natural history, the environmental science that's going on around Fort Pulaski. It's imperative that we talk about that with our visitors. First, I think there's a sense of awe, especially when I can stand next to a fort and say, well, the water level came up to this level, and I can point out, I can actually point to a spot where there was a water line. And I can describe a hurricane from the 1880s that actually put 5 feet more water in the fort after that, and kind of mixing our current state of affairs with our history. To see folks actually register what's going on here with these storms and with the water levels, they certainly leave impacted by that. I don't know if we're there yet. I think we're getting close to a point where we're going to have to really think about that. That's certainly, until we talked about it earlier, I don't think I've ever really sat down to think, especially with the Cockspur Island Lighthouse. We have a friends group that is extremely passionate for the lighthouse. And right now, it's fine. It has a riprap that was put out there just a few years ago, but as the water level rises, and for Savannah, as we get an increase in larger container vessels, that lighthouse is going to be further attacked by man and nature, and that there may be a point we have to talk about when is it enough? How far do we raise that riprap? It's certainly something I don't want to think about, but we have to. I hope that my family is able to come out to Cockspur Island, be able to park, and walk into the fort and be able to say that their ancestor was an employee here, and then also get into the total history of the fort. In 100 years, though, I'm not sure what it's going to be. The fort's going to be here. I have no doubt in my mind that this is a well-engineered, well-constructed fort that even if there's 5 feet of water and it's an island, it will be here. But while the fort might be here, we're going to have to change the way that we tell the story because it may be surrounded by water. There may be impacts that visitors can't come out here, and that we might be doing programs, online, virtual reality programs, whatever the newest technology is in 100 years. They may not actually be able to stand out here as we are today. It's heartbreaking. Having this discussion now, but also now the hindsight of everything that's happened over the last year for not only me, but our staff here. We've been very resilient as we recover from everything that's been thrown at us. But it truly is heartbreaking to see all this happen, to have to come back in here and recover. And if we see an uptick in activity and we have to continually do this, it kind of just really beats on you, thinking of what the future really means for Fort Pulaski, what lies ahead. And it's something that I'm still trying to grapple with. So Savannah is one of the largest container ports in the United States. We see a tremendous amount of ship traffic heading from the Atlantic Ocean upriver, and Fort Pulaski is right at the mouth of the Savannah River. So every ship that goes up there passes by here. And these are very large vessels. And in fact, with the completion of the new Panama Canal, they're getting even bigger. And they displace a tremendous amount of water, which right now affects our north shoreline with erosion, would affect the marsh that is also on the north shore of the island, even our Cockspur Island Lighthouse. It's only 46 feet tall. It really doesn't sit on much of an island at all. It has a protective riprap around it, just recently placed in, but those ships are going to put a tremendous amount of stress and water on these natural and cultural resources as we move forward. I'm not sure, to be honest with you, but we have to have those conversations now. We can't wait 5, 10, 15 years. We have to have them now, or it'll be too late.